My Spear Weighs Heavy in My Hand by Jack Anderson. Part 3. Flight. We rested until daybreak. Babu barely spoke but to groan. Eventually we stopped as the sun rose over the distant hills, bare but for the dusty earth and dry shrubs. We sheltered near a stream on the shade of an olive grove, that heady olive smell permeating the air, and the ground thick with fallen leaves. Birds sung their dawn chorus, and mingled with the laboured breathing of our horses and the pitiful groans of my friend Babu, his left eye swollen shut. I breathed, trying to savour the peace around me, but I could not. I felt broken and mad, like the events of the night before were unreal, distant. It was one of those rare moments where your life is profoundly different, where you find yourself in misery, mourning who you used to be, and before you've managed to figure out who you now are. A little death, and the knowledge that you will never go back to the life you had before lurks in your soul, ready to pounce and consume your every thought. 2 years before, I had had a time like that, when my tribe marched into darkness, and a lion gorged on my arm. I kept thinking of it, the scream of Tamsi echoing across the years. It was like a fever in my mind, insistent and pulsing. But first I had questions, and I planned to demand answers. I planned to demand them, to take them by force if I must. Yasmin, I said, I need you to speak. I need you to tell me what happened last night. I don't know, she said. Not all of it, anyway. Which parts of it are you talking about? All of it, I said, realising I was shouting and not caring in the least. Every piece. What were those things? How did you stop them? Why did they kill the prince? Why are you in Imphobek? She sighed deeply and traced a pattern in the mud with her finger. I suppose, she said, that I should start from the beginning. I truly do not know all of what happened. I cannot even begin to guess at it all, but I shall tell you all I can, all that you might be ready to understand. Then what were those things? I asked. That I do not know, she said. Then, sensing my ire, said, Truly I have no idea. Nor is it likely anyone else knows either. I've never heard in all my years of anything like them at all. That means they're either very new or very old, or from very, very far away. And what makes you so sure of that? I said. She thought for a moment, savouring the air, and said, I grew up in the Tower of Perfection. Have you heard of it? You mentioned it while we were dining, I said. But other than that, no, I have not. I see, she said. Very well. I was brought to the Tower of Perfection as a child. There we are taught all manner of things, though most famously we are taught to find the gaps, the little spaces of power between the destruction of the gods and the creation of the wanderers, and to reach into them, to move them. We commune with spirits, pull on tendrils winnowing away from the underworld, to gather up the strands in the weave of fate and forge them into something new. We are taught other things, of course. We're taught to write and to understand the seasons and the nature of stars and the phases of the moon, but those are mundane things that any may learn. I was told by my masters that something in the southern edge of Imphobek had disturbed the perfected one, and that I must discover it. I was brought here in glory, on a barge festooned in purple and gold, and I was presented to the king. It took weeks to sail from Nathran, travel through Rubissia, through Morona, and into Imphobek. I saw so many wonders, so many peoples, so many tribes. But I had a task, and I could not linger. Perhaps I shall when I return. Yasmin looked happy for a moment, a bright smile beaming across her gently freckled face. It did not last. Her face fell, and she continued. The king gave me leave to travel with his son to the southern tip of his kingdom, though I told him nothing of my task. I argued your case with the prince. I told him that even if Babu was somehow the murderer, you, at least, were certainly innocent. I need you to know that I tried. But he had spoken to that little girl, and he was inconsolable. He had convinced himself of Babu's guilt, listened to the testimony of the child, and seen her tears, and his heart had broken for her. He was kind, as princes go, I promise you that. I did not see those things as they attacked. Not until the prince's blood was in the air and his soul had left his body. I saw them, the sand monsters, those things, those phantoms. I saw them come for you, and I reached into the ether, and I spoke the shielding word, and I kept you alive as best I could. Those are the answers I can give you. I do not know what they are. I do not know why they killed the prince. I do not know what they want. I have never heard tell of such creatures. Even the spirits do not know. But I know the spirits fear them. Babu slept all day. If truth be told, I must admit that I dozed for most of the day as well, nestled in the olive grove and wrapped in my tunic. The water from the stream was fresh and clean, and Yasmin used it to wash Babu's wounds and tend to him while the horses drank and whinnied. She did not tire, despite the hours that had passed, and I remained wary of her, with her strange life and her strange pale skin. Eventually we did speak, not of our lives or the events at Imphobek, but of food. We were hungry, and had fled with nothing, and our stomachs were making themselves known. Even the olives would be no help to us. They were bitter and vile and far from ripe. She spoke about the food they would be given in her tower, bread and meats loaded with onions and garlic and other spices I'd never heard of before. I told her about spinach and okra, sesame bread and tahini. She told me about her favourite meals, and I listened, nodding, then told her about mine, as we both began to realise our hunger was making us delirious, and we began to laugh. As the laughter died, we stood in awkward silence, neither of us quite willing to speak. Eventually I sighed a long, world-weary sigh and asked the question we had been so carefully avoiding. What should we do? Yasmin's shoulders slumped, and she shook her head as if to say she was as lost as me. What are our options? I asked. We can't just live here in this grove. We cannot go back to Imphobek unless we want to be killed by sand monsters or whatever's left of the prince's bodyguard. We cannot cross the desert to the south. We cannot reach the sea. It's a week away, and we have no food. We must go north, said Yasmin. What is north? I asked. Obekush, said Babu. Both of us started in surprise, turning to see my old friend had managed to raise himself to sit against an olive tree. Obekush is north, said Babu. Then Obek. We can reach Obekush in a day if we stay off the road, then Obek 3 days after. Nobody will know us there. We'll be safe. I need to know my children are safe. I need to know that nobody's hunting my family to punish them for what was done to the prince. I did not open my mouth to speak, but knew then with a cold certainty that we would be going north, further from my home, further from my friends and into danger. There was something about Babu, about the set of his face and the way the evening shadows played across it, that looked determined, grim, like the end of the world. We stayed put for another night. Babu needed more rest. Before we slept, I went to try to find something to eat, but Babu took one look at the mushrooms I'd found and told me they were no good. At best they would make me vomit, and at worst they would kill me. I slept uneasily that night, full of hunger and fear. We woke and washed as best we could in the stream before mounting our horses and riding north. We left the olive grove behind, and found ourselves once again in desert, though Babu assured us we would reach Obekush by nightfall. For 3 hours our horses trudged on, the oppressive heat of the day beating down on us all. There had been water-skins strapped to their saddles, and we had filled them all, though pangs of hunger still made themselves known. I took stock as we were riding, and was relieved to find that the kopesh I had taken from the floor of Babu's house was sharp, and the saddlebags contained money, just a few davans, but enough to trade for food when we reached a tavern. I daydreamed about it. I tried not to, but I had eaten nothing at all for a full day, and my mind would not allow me peace. Do you see that? Said Yasmin, pointing to the west. Babu and I looked, squinting across the vast expanse of sand, and there was something there, a tiny black speck on the horizon. "It is a sunless citadel," said Yasmin, "built by the wanderers before the gods came to the world." "I just want to find some food," said Babu, assuming she wanted to go and see it up close. "That's all I want right now. We can go and look at it on the way back." Yasmin laughed. "We cannot," she said. "None can. That citadel is special. You could ride towards it for a day, a night, a week, a year, never get any closer. It would just be out of reach for hours upon hours upon hours. And then one moment you would look away, or blink, and it would be behind you, just as distant, and you would be on the other side of the desert." I frowned, trying to understand. "But surely," I said, "you would find yourself within it, or beside it. Could you not close your eyes and ride to it?" Yasmin smiled. "It has all been tried. Every idea you might have had about it has been attempted time and again for hundreds of years. The Tower of Perfection sent expedition after expedition to try to reach the tower, to measure the desert, to take a rope and lay it across the desert, to drive animals to it, to shoot bows at it. The measurers lose count, the ropes break, the animals vanish, the arrows hit the ground. It cannot be reached, and none know why. Perhaps some wanderer sits within it still, using their power to baffle the curious." I looked again, and to me the desert looked strange, like the sand was shimmering in a heat haze, or like it was behaving like water, swirling with eddies and currents, rising and falling like waves. "There are other sunless citadels," said Yasmin. "There is one near Obek. You will see it in a little while." "I've seen it," said Babu. "It's rubbish. Mostly rubble." He had been miserable for hours. He had not cracked a smile since the night before. He was sliding slowly into one of his bleak and lasting black moods. Perhaps it was no surprise, given all that had happened, but his moods did not always change with circumstance. Sometimes they simply came and went. This mood, this bleak melancholy, could be dangerous. It was then that I realized Babu was no longer with us. I motioned to Yasmin to stop and rode back to him. He had stopped his horse and was sat on it, staring forlornly at his belly, the expression on his face one of abject misery. "Babu," I said softly, "come on, friend. We'll be at Obekush before you know it. We need to keep going." "Just leave me here," he said, so quietly I could barely hear him. "What's the point? I couldn't save the prince, and he thought I was a murderer, and my children are better off without me." "Babu," I said, trading off. My stomach sank. I knew what was coming, and sure enough, he burst into tears. We were going to have to be here a little while, until he regained his composure. "I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do." It was his mantra at times like these. Sometimes he would sink into this kind of black despair, this pit of emptiness, where there was no hope. I had nursed him out of it before, but it never quite left him. There was always a touch of it, just behind his eyes. Obekush was not a big city, but it had some enormous temples, and its main street thronged with people. That was not what caught my eye, though, despite my hunger, despite the smell of food wafting through the air, and the strangely dressed foreigners peddling their wares. What caught my eye was something I had never seen before, something wonderful, something I had only ever heard described. What caught my eye were the ships. Oh, we had little coracles and rowing boats for fishing and transport in Mastanab, of course, but nothing like the vessels docked in the river running through Obekush. There were two of them. They were beautiful and huge, with great triangular red sails painted with images of some mighty warrior commandingly holding aloft a fearsome trident. On their prows were painted images of bright eyes glaring coldly ahead. They must have been big enough to carry tons of grain, and sturdy enough to take them across oceans. Or so I thought. I had never seen such wonders, and I was lost in them. "The inn," Yasmin said, pointing at a large building a short way away. We had ridden from the west, having nearly overshot in the desert, and as the sun set we stabled our horses, and the three of us burst in the door, calling for food before we had a chance to think. We were ravenous, desperate, and not thinking clearly. The inn itself was a dreary place. Every surface was crusted in filth, and the innkeeper was even more portly and sickly looking than Babu. I've got bread, fresh this morning, and a stew with hare and chicken. Dumplings will cost extra, as will cheese. Got ale, too. Look like you could do with it." "We'll take all of it," said Babu. "Everything, and rooms for the night." I looked at my friend. He had cheered up immeasurably since the city was in sight, and sometimes that was all it took. A little flicker of undeniable hope, even something tiny, even if it was just a good meal. Yasmin, on the other hand, had seemed to become ever more concerned and furtive. She stood out even more than me, incredibly pale among the people of Obekush. She was spending a lot of time looking down, and had unfurled her sleeves to cover her arms despite the heat. But what stood out to me was her quietness. It was like she had shrunk into herself. The confidence and gregariousness that had beamed out of her in Imphobek had diminished, and she was a shell of herself. Or maybe she too was just hungry. I tried to think if I had changed, but the bottomless hunger in me left no room for introspection. We sat fidgeting impatiently in that filthy inn for what felt like forever, waiting for food. More people began to slink in, calling for food or going upstairs to their rooms. The day was ending. The market stalls were being packed away, the hawkers were stowing their wares, the foreigners had retired to the cabins on their ships, and the nightlife was beginning. I barely remember the bowl being put in front of me, but I remember the taste of it. When you're hungry, food tastes better, it is known, and that stew was the best thing I have ever eaten. Even at times of famine, even during plagues when grain supplies are disrupted, even in sieges there's something to eat. There is always something to eat. Even those who starve to death have often eaten something every day, just not enough. We had eaten nothing at all for a day and a night, and the food we had was the sweetest nectar. After eating in silence and joy, we ordered drinks, and drank them far faster than we should have done. The wine went straight to my head, a strong drink from the north, poured from an amphora, a clay jar shaped like a trophy. "I'm stopping," I announced after the second cup. "If I have any more, I'll be no use to anyone tomorrow. Nor will you two. We need rest. A lot of it. We've got busy days ahead." I wish I had known. I wish I had known how busy the days would get, or what would lay in store for me. I have a lot of regrets about that time, but I do not regret welcoming her hours later when Yasmin crept into my bed that night. Dawn broke, and I awoke to find myself alone. I shook my head for a moment, thinking back to the night before, and realized that, yes, that had happened. Then I remembered the day, and the night before that, and my mood darkened again. I dressed and went to the outhouse, then went back to the main room of the inn. The sun was well over the horizon. I had slept in late. I found Babu and Yasmin at a table in the corner, talking animatedly and tucking into some bread and cheese. I regarded Yasmin in the light. Her small frame, her delicate features were they were a little mesmerizing. Or perhaps I was just smitten. Either way, I decided to be happy about it. I had something to be joyful about, so I went and sat between her and Babu and helped myself to some food. "So where are they?" Yasmin asked Babu, showing me a brief but warm smile as I took my seat. "But nearby, I think. They're my cousins, and they buy the pelts of beasts from me. They shouldn't be too hard to find, but I haven't been here for a year or so." I remembered his last trip. He had sworn never to go north again, complained about the journey, and hired men to deliver his goods next time. They were good lads, didn't skim any more than was reasonable, and were always on time, but I knew they weren't cheap. Babu did not travel well. "Well, that's good," said Yasmin. "You should meet them, organise this passage. See if you can sell those horses so we can get something more inconspicuous, less, thoroughbred. If you can't do that, you at least need to sell the saddles. They're so gaudy we might as well be shouting they belong to royalty. Good idea, said Babu. What will you be doing? We, she gestured at me, have to go to the Emir's palace. I hear rumours that something peculiar is happening there, and we ought to find out what it is. I don't want any more surprises. If those sand creatures are going to attack again, I wish to know. Babu furrowed his brow and looked at Yasmin. What sand creatures? He said. What are you talking about? We sat in silence for a moment. The sand creatures, I said. The sand phantoms. I lowered my voice to a whisper. Babu was giving me a blank look. The ones who attacked Imphobek? They were right in front of us. I didn't see any sand creatures, Babu hissed. What? Said Yasmin and I simultaneously. Look, said Babu, whispering again. The prince was there. Then all of a sudden he was dead. Great big gashes on him, blood everywhere. And all the guards were dead. And you two were carrying me out of there. Where were these sand phantoms? Everywhere, I said. They were all over the place. What did you think killed him? You, said Babu. Me? You thought I did that? I said. Yes, said Babu. How? I asked. I don't know, hissed Babu. I was just going to ask you, but we've been running for our lives, if you hadn't fucking noticed. All right, I said. Well, what did you think we were going to Obek for? I thought we were going to lie low for a while, said Babu. Stay out of sight until the heat died down, because he killed the... He checked himself and shifted his chair closer. It rasped noisily across the floor. Because he killed the fucking Crown Prince. I sat and pondered this for a minute. So, is all I managed to say before Babu interrupted. Why in the name of Nubitsit ranting piss are we going to Obek then? Well, I said, so that Yasmin can inform the king of the death of his son and of our innocence. You really thought I'd killed the prince? Yes, said Babu. And you were going to help me get away with it? I said. Yes, said Babu. Oh, I said. Thank you, Thank you. I patted him on the shoulder. There may even have been tears in my eyes. Well, said Yasmin, this is all very nice, but I think we ought to get under way. The city was larger than I had first thought. A hill towards its west end hid a sprawl of squares and the large houses of the wealthy. They were all white sandstone here, but the statues of gods, wanderers and kings were well maintained and beautifully painted. In the distance I could see dozens of tombs, great monuments to the wealthy and the noble, the kind Babu could expect if he was risen to Emir. They were beautiful, tall statues forming avenues leading to delicate square buildings containing the remains of generations of nobility. Towering above it all was the palace of the Emir. It was fully 40 feet tall, topped with a sculpture of Hyrotster, the sun god, in his aspect as a baleful, burning eye. It glared across the city, atop a building painted with white and copper. Statues of previous emirs lined its walls, and the doors were carved from some exotic dark wood, of a kind I had never seen before. They were also shut. There were soldiers outside it, facing across the square and turning away anyone who came close. They were wearing armour of the kind the prince's entourage had worn, solid and practical leather, covered with bronze studs and thick bronze breastplates. This could be a problem, Yasmin said. We were standing at the edge of the square, opposite the Emir's palace, watching the people come and go. Is this unusual? I asked, gesturing at the scene in front of me, as a clerk carrying reams of papyrus had a loud argument with the guard barring his entry. No, said Yasmin. Emirs are supposed to keep an open house, and today he should be holding court. Something's very wrong here. Then what should we do? I asked, and was surprised to see that she had marched forward, drawing herself up and gesturing for me to follow. I checked my sword was at my side, cursing the bizarre weight and shape of the Phobekians' Kopesh weapons, and followed her. She walked right past the clerk carrying the papers, a man of about 30 years with a furious expression, and stood in front of the guard. "You?" she said, and the guard exploded with rage. "I'm sick and tired of this," he shouted. "The palace is fucking closed today, obviously. If I saw you watching us, we'd been turning everyone away. If I had to repeat myself again, if I have to tell one more fucking peasant to piss off, I'm going to fucking stab someone. We are closed. To everyone. But especially to a pair of foreigners from God's only knows where. Do you hear me? Are you a guard supposed to be chummy with the locals where you're from? Can you speak for Beckian?" Yasmin glared at him, and it was a withering, furious glare, but the guard impressed me with his bravery and squared up to her, and then, before I knew what was happening, I realised I was standing between them, pushing him back. "Listen, sunshine," he said, before being mercifully interrupted by a commanding, powerful voice from the doors of the palace. "Stand down, Derops." The man coming down the steps was dressed in the armours of a guard lieutenant, a Mitan. It was gorgeous. Bronze plates and scale padding shone in the daylight. Unusually, he was carrying a spear and wearing a patchwork cloak of fraying rags. He was paler than the Imphobekans, but the thing that stood out was his enormous size. I had to crane my neck to look at his face. "I know this woman," said the huge man. "She is a companion of Prince Rashidi, and most certainly outranks... Well," he turned from the guard to us, "let us speak indoors. Come." He gestured for us to follow, and strode into the palace with the pair of us nearly jogging to keep up. "I'm afraid I've forgotten your name," he said to Yasmin. "And I'm not certain you and I have ever met," he said to me. We introduced ourselves. Yasmin was stiff and formal, and I tried to be as friendly as possible. There was a champion of the Kirebaden, my tribe's oldest enemy, who I had duelled one morning in front of their village. He had been nearly as big as this enormous specimen, and with one blow of his shield he had sent me tumbling across the dusty ground and into a ditch. I had smashed my head on a rock and yielded. We had not raided their village that day. I did not want to repeat that fight. "I am Brokos," he said, "guard lieutenant, and more or less in charge around here. We could do with some guidance if you're willing, Mistress Yasmin. You might both be as foreign as I am, but I'm at a loss. We'll go to the clerk's offices. They're empty, and I'll need to talk to you through the nature of this emergency." I caught sight of some opulent luxury before Brokos led us through to the servants' quarters. Statues lined the halls, and the walls and ceilings were painted with intricate religious frescoes, but I had no time to take it all in before we were striding purposefully through the squat, dark, whitewashed corridors. The chair Brokos sat in was too small for him, and the room itself was too big for the three of us. There were rows of desks and piles of papyrus everywhere, and one wall was dominated by a huge map of the city, with extra scrolls pinned on with details of homeowners, shopkeepers, and trade routes. He had given us light beer from the palace stores, a delicate taste of the luxury of the life of the emir. Yasmin adjusted her green dress beside me, trying to hide the places in which it had become frayed. "Emir Atunath is dead," said Brokos, "and so are his wives, and his sons, and his grandchildren, and the high priest of the temple of Hieropsta, and his family, and most of the nobles in the city, and their families, and about half of the palace guard who were on duty last night." His face was dark. This pained him. It shocked me, and it shocked Yasmin into silence. "They were murdered." I knew. I knew before he said it. I had known from the moment I had seen the palace closed and the city subdued, but I had not allowed myself to believe it. "When?" said Yasmin, a tremble in her voice. "2 nights ago, a couple of hours after sundown," said Brokos. "Though I understand from the survivors the slaughter took a while. It was vicious." There was an edge of misery to his voice, behind the lackadaisical casualness of his demeanour. He brushed his patchwork cloak with his fingers as he spoke, staring into the distance. I felt sure behind his thick, curly beard, that he did not look happy. 2 nights ago, the same night we were attacked. Who killed them? I asked, knowing even as I spoke what answer would come. Nobody knows. All the reports I have are garbled nonsense. Even my most stalwart men talk of phantoms tearing into flesh and corpses twitching on their own for hours after death. And now we must investigate and root these killers out, but, well, before that we need to establish the king's order here. There is nobody in charge but me, and I am a foreigner with no rank outside the palace guard. The guards have only followed my instructions because they respect my reputation, and barring the doors and turning away all visitors is not something I can do forever. Already citizens are asking questions. Traders are beginning to pack up their goods and leave. They believe there is trouble brewing, and they may be right. What's your disposition? Said Yasmin, barely missing a beat as I sat writhing in terror. My what? Said Brokos. The outhouse is left along the corridor and out the door, straight ahead, he said to me. I excused myself while they discussed the manpower of the palace guard and what resources they had available to them. Their voices were a dull echo as I shambled down the corridor. I was gripped with that strange curse the gods sent to men for whom fear has become overwhelming. The fear when hope is lost in battle, the blinding, urgent tide of panic. I shoved open the door to the outside and slumped, desperate for breath, against the palace wall. My head was spinning. The memory of the last few days had been occluded by the urgency of the flight and the distraction of Yasmin's body, and now it had all washed over me at once, the crushing horror of being utterly adrift in a world that was not my own. And it was then that the realization dawned that I would never find my people. Not ever. Not unless I lived and found a place to live in safety and keep Babu safe so his contacts could come back to him. What if they were there now, galloping into Imphobek with news that we would never hear? And were we hunted by the sand phantoms? How could we protect ourselves from creatures only Yasmin and I could see? Creatures that would appear from thin air and rip and slash into our flesh, interfere with our corpses and leave our blood soaking into the soil beneath us. Were these things a curse? A punishment from some vengeful god? A scheme of the Deva? How many guards survived the massacre at Imphobek and were riding here now, hunting for the man they thought was a murderer, and the last man to see their prince alive? I could not breathe. I could not breathe. I could not breathe. The darkness rushes in, and I am falling through an empty void. I cannot tell which way is up, or whether I am alive or dead. I know I am not alone. I can taste filth. Black shapes winnow and wisp around me. They are invisible in the darkness, but I know they're there. The sound begins to rumble, a mighty voice, a chorus, first humming, then shouting. They are saying my family's names. I see the 40,000. They are naked on their knees, raising their arms in adoration at a single burning gargantuan figure in front of them. The giant shines with searing light. It hurts to look at. The 40,000 are wailing in abject supplication. They are at prayer. Smoke rises in the distance. There is a fire on the horizon. Their voices rise. They are screaming now in desperation. The wail becomes a scream, loud and piercing. The void shakes, and I shake with it. Light pierces once more, and I awake. I woke up to see the sun had not moved far. I had fallen asleep for only a little while. I looked over the small courtyard with the outhouses for the palace clerks. It stank, but someone had planted patches of jasmine and daisies to cover it as best they could. There was a stream running through the little garden, diverted through the length of the palace, and an acacia tree grew by a wall in the corner. The water was filthy by the time it reached there, but it made the flowers bloom. I stood, slowly getting to my feet. feeling a twinge of pain in my back. Perhaps I was no longer the young and sprightly thing I thought I was. When I returned to the clerk's rooms, I was surprised to find Yasmin and Brockos gone. I sought them out, wandering the halls of the palace, losing myself in the art and decoration in the living quarters and the temple grounds. The central courtyard was huge, a paradise garden lined with seated statues of emirs, pomegranate trees, grapevines, and roses. I found them eventually in the banqueting hall, seated at the long tables, looking despondent. Brockos was drinking from a cup that looked like it might be made of solid gold, and Yasmin was just staring into space. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting beside Yasmin on a thickly cushioned, embroidered chair. "Brockos has not got enough men to keep the peace," said Yasmin. "Not even close. And the town is growing restive. It is far from clear who the new emir should be, and the traders must be convinced to stay, so the farmers can sell the pomegranates and papyrus crops. There are no magistrates to oversee the disputes in the marketplace. There are no nobles to organize the peasantry. There is nobody to appoint new magistrates or nobles. There are 50 guards. There are 18,000 peasants." "The moment I explain our situation, there will be a riot," said Brockos. There was no doubt in his voice. He stated it flatly. Yasmin wordlessly handed me a golden cup filled to the brim with the most delicious wine I have ever tasted. I drank deep. "Is there any reason," I asked Brockos, "that you can't just leave?" "Around 15 of the palace guard already had that idea. The gods alone know where they've got to. I will not abandon the rest of my men," he said. "And I will not abandon my post. I swore an oath to the emir, and I will not break it just because he is dead." I nodded, sipped again from my wine. Brockos called for more drink, and one of his guards brought a bottle in. The man was clearly already drunk himself, and I could not blame him. "Then you will have to declare that you're in charge. Claim you have more men than you do, and hope that mollifies everyone." I was surprised at the sounds of my own voice, but a coldness had grown in me. I was feeling angry and hopeless, and I was desperate to feel contempt for something, for anything, for this giant of a man who had sat around in this palace feeling sorry for himself, for these people who worshipped their king as a god and were still terrified of his wrath, vassals of another king, in turn worshipped as a god by his people, for myself, for my failures, for my inaction. "Sir," came a voice from the far northern corner of the banqueting hall, "may I speak with you? It's urgent." Brockos made his apologies and left, leaving me and Yasmin alone at the banquet table of a dead man's house. I was drinking the finest wine I had ever tasted. I was sat with a beautiful woman in a palace, surrounded by opulence, and it did not even occur to me to try to enjoy it. I smiled at Yasmin, and she smiled back, but I could see there was fear in her as well. I looked upon the painted carvings embossed on the walls. They showed the gods, human with animal heads, smiting the Deva who had overrun the world. The Deva were tiny, pitiful figures, helpless against the wrath of the Holy Ones. In some places, towering above the hordes of Deva, were unrepentant wanderers, the ones who had defied the gods and refused to bow before them. They were not the best carvings I had seen. Babu's were better, but they were certainly the largest. Above us, in the middle of the ceiling, Hieropster, the sun god, stared down the aspect of a crowned oryx. "We should not have come here," said Yasmin at length. "We should have simply watered the horses and moved on. I should have taken us to the marketplace and found a messenger to send to the tower for guidance. We should have stayed close to Babu." "Come now," I said. "I agree this sounds like a bit of trouble we could do without, but it's not that dire. We're safe." I got no further. Yasmin gave me a look of withering scorn. "In what world are we safe?" she asked, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Unnatural creatures tried to kill us not 2 nights past. The same creatures slaughtered the entire nobility of the city in which we sit, and we are some of the very few witnesses to the death of the crown prince of this nation. We need allies, fast, and we need a way to get to Obek safely. Also..." She trailed off. A moment of deep concentration furrowed her brow. I tried to speak again and was met with an insistent shush and a raised index finger. "What?" I asked, after a while of sitting in silence. "We need to leave," she said. "Right now. Right now." "Why?" I asked dumbly, unsteadily getting to my feet and beginning to follow her as she began to run through the corridors. "Because I recognized the man who came to speak to Brockos," she said, running. "From where?" I asked, trying to keep up. "From my journey to Imphobek," Yasmin said. "He was one of the prince's men. I'm sorry, I should have realized immediately." My heart pounded in my chest. So some of them had survived. Some of the prince's men lived, which meant we were hunted. As far as they knew, we were arrested for murder, then the prince was dead and we had bolted in the night. We had to flee, right now. We had to leave the palace and hide as best we could until we could leave the city. I picked up the pace. Yasmin leaped up into a corridor and then stopped suddenly, holding up a hand for me to stop as well. I cast about, looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing nearby, and I'd left my koppesh in the table in our haste to leave. I picked up a vase. It would do for one blow, and that might be enough. "No," I said as we burst through a door and realized we were in a courtyard full of outhouses. "No, no, no, no." We had turned the wrong way. There was only one entrance, and I could hear shouting in the distance. "The tree! The tree!" I shouted, pointing and running towards it. "Come on!" I leaped as high as I could, casting aside the vase I was still unaccountably carrying, and grabbed a low-hanging branch. I made sure I had a tight grip, then turned and reached out a hand for Yasmin, who was still standing on the other side of the courtyard, facing the closed door and muttering under her breath. "Come on!" I yelled, trying to figure out what she could possibly be doing. Her arms were stretched out behind her, her hands curled, and she was leaning forward as if stepping into a howling gale. I was about to shout again, and then she spoke a word and flung her arms before her, and the dusty earth raised into the air and hurled towards the door in great torrents. I heard it shudder and splatter as it whirled around Yasmin, covering her blue dress in filth, and piled against the door and wall around it in a huge mound. Then she turned and ran to me, a look of supreme elation on her face. I caught her, bracing for impact, but she was as light as a bird, and lifting her onto the branch was easy work. There was a pounding noise at the door, and the earth piled up around it shook with each impact. "Yasmin!" came the shout from inside, Brockos's voice booming and furious. "You have nowhere to go. You are arrested." We'd heard enough. We were over the wall and away. We reached the inn a short while later, unhitched the horses and walked them through the streets, head bowed. There were very few people outside. The marketplace was deserted, and we could hear the tolling of a bell in the distance. The dust billowed up to my knees, and the sun beat down from on high as we searched for any sign of Babu and kept alert for any sign the guards may be seeking us. "Who is he, anyway?" I asked, barely above a whisper, trying to distract myself. "Who is who?" asked Yasmin, her eyes scanning between the baked clay houses around us. "Brockos," I said. "He doesn't look local. How's he in charge of the guard?" "I should think he's a Dastran exile," said Yasmin. "They wear patchwork cloaks, and they're huge, whole Rubissian tribe of giants." "Where's Rubissia?" I asked, knowing only that it was vaguely north. "Really?" asked Yasmin. "Well, it's huge. Everything north of Morona and south and west of the Rubis Sea. Everything east of the Rothine Forest. Dozens of cities, each with their own laws and customs, united by a way of war and by their fear of the gods and adoration of the Wanderers." "So not a country?" I asked. "No, but a people," she said. "Sort of. They're forever at war with each other, but none of them ever declare war on the Dastrans. They fear the Dastrans." "Why?" I asked. "Because they are the greatest warriors in the world," said Yasmin. "They are unbeatable. They do nothing but train for war. They spend their days on practice fields, marching in phalanx, spears in hand, fighting and training, and nothing else." We ducked into a gap between two low clay brick buildings as some guards marched by, taking the horses with us. They walked past in silence, not even glancing in our direction, though I felt my heart must be beating loudly enough to summon them on its own. I wrestled my fear under control, forced it deep within me. "They can't spend all day training for war," I said. "They must trade or work the fields, and some of them must be priests or something from time to time." "No," Yasmin said, peering around the corner at the retreating backs of the guards. "They have a huge number of slaves, a whole tribe of other Rubicians, and they say those few who grow too old or injured for battle serve as priests. Now, this way." She darted around the corner, dragging her horse behind her, and I followed with mine and Babu's. We dashed behind a low round house in desperate need of repair, with rotting vine leaves thatching the roof, and found ourselves in an olive grove beside the river. We quickened our pace, dashing through as the thick, heady scent assailed our senses, and I felt the fear in me subside. I am not a coward. I am not. I have fought in wars and in duels, led night raids, and been wounded time and again in battle, but I knew then, as I know now, that there were far too many men in the city guard for me to fight alone. "What now?" I said, sitting down once again with Yasmin in another olive grove. "I don't know," she said. "We need to get out of here. Have you any idea where Babu went?" "None," I said. "But I know they sell pelts. Can't be that many pelt traders round here." "Then we'll go back into the town by night," said Yasmin, "and find them, and then leave, go north. If we reach Obek, we can speak to the king, clear Babu's name, and ours too. He's a reasonable man, he'll listen." She did not sound very sure of herself. We stopped with the sails of the Rubician ships just barely still in view in the distance. We tied the horses and laid down to rest in the shade of the olive trees. After a while, a very little while, she came to lie with me.